So verse 53, they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And at dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered round him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Brilliant, brilliant story. Just keep it in front of you for a moment if you can. I want to begin with just one question about this text. And if you were following it in a Bible, whether it was on an app or in a printed version, you will have seen that it says the earliest manuscripts don't have this included. And I just want to, this is kind of like all in brackets, but just for those of you that wonder about that sort of stuff, let me explain what's going on. The early manuscripts didn't have it. The earliest commentators who wrote, sort of like 3rd century, didn't write about it. They didn't include this, but it came later. But one of the interesting things was there was an early bishop who was around sort of like 120, and he was a friend of John. And he writes about a story where some men brought a woman who'd sinned to Jesus. So it's kind of like what's going on is that there's stories that are circulating that may not have actually made it into the earliest manuscripts, but these were all around. Now, this is, I think, two things just to say, and all in brackets, but just to say this. One, some people go, well, the Bible's just made up, innit? You can't trust it. It was just made up by blokes who all got together and put it together. And I think the fact that in our Bibles, it tells you earliest manuscripts don't have this is a remarkable security about going, actually, we're not trying to fool you here. We're not trying to make it up. We're not trying to side swipe you. We'll tell you when it's not the earliest manuscript. I think that tells you something about the validity of Christianity. We're not trying to fool you. We're not trying to deceive you. We'll tell you what's actually going on. Secondly, it reminds us that there were stories doing the rounds of Jesus, about Jesus, all the time. Do you remember when Luke begins his gospel? Some of you will remember this. Luke tells us, I looked at all the stories, and I came together to bring them together. John, at the end of his gospel, will say, there were so many stories, we could have filled a library with them. In other words, there's loads of stories about Jesus. This was one of the early ones that then later they inserted into the Gospel of John. And I think it's a good place to put it in. You see, in chapter 7, if you were here last week, you would have been looking at some of these questions. Could Jesus be the Messiah? The one we've longed for? Is he the Messiah? The guards and Nicodemus, they're sort of going with the crowd. And the leaders of Judaism at the time are going, this is not right. We'll explain why they might have been worried about who Jesus was in a minute, but that's what's going on in chapter 7. And then in the rest of chapter 8, you've got Jesus speaking, going, I'm standing with God. And secondly, I'm older than Abraham. I'm standing with God and I'm older than Abraham. Now, all of that to say this. You guys, I know you need to leave. I know it's nothing I've said. But just before you leave, let me say one thing, all right? Because then you can go. In fact, but the rest of you can't. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. That's what chapter 8 is about. You can go. Have a good day. It's that sense of, don't try and imagine what God's like. Don't make him up as a mirror image of yourself. If you want to know what God's like, look at Jesus. So this morning, when we start to look at this story, what we're going is, when we feel frightened, when we've messed up, when we are willing to settle for less, what does God think of that? Now, the danger is when we start like that, when we've messed up, when we're not quite what God would want, or we're frightened about trusting him, we might think God's really cross with us. Look at Jesus. And in a sense, this story fits within 7 and 8 really well. Because it's not really just about who Jesus is, but it's about who God is. And who Jesus is to you and to me this morning. The authorities want to stop him. I say lots of times in church in my own place, bless you. I don't say that. What I say is this. The first century authorities did not crucify Jesus because Jesus simply said, love one another. The first century authorities did not crucify Jesus because Jesus said, be nice to one another. The first century authorities did not crucify Jesus because Jesus just said, be good. Jesus was deeply disturbing to anybody who had any power or authority in the first century. That's why they crucified him. He threatened their security. His new way rocked the boat. The powerful, and to be honest, these Jewish leaders were not that powerful because they were overseen by Roman oppressors, but actually they had some power, and they would rather hold on to the little bit of power they had. They'd rather hold on to the limitations of their own life than accept the invitation of the newness that Jesus would offer them. In other words, Jesus was deeply disturbing to those who thought things were okay. They may not be perfect, but they're okay. Don't rock my boat, in other words. So they set a trap for Jesus. Because what they needed to do was get rid of Jesus. That's what they were trying to do. Silence him and get rid of him. So they set a trap. They brought this lady in who'd been caught in adultery. Interestingly, didn't bring the man, but brought the woman, set a trap for Jesus, and said, will you uphold the Jewish law? If you don't, you're a blasphemer, and we will eliminate you. If you do uphold the Jewish law, and you allow us to stone her, the Romans will eliminate you. That's what they were doing. That's the trap. Either way, the Jewish authorities were saying to Jesus, we don't want you here because you are messing with our security. Either way, we want you out of here. We want you gone. And either we will eliminate you because we will say, see, he doesn't follow the law of Moses. He must be a blasphemer. How can he be the Messiah? Or if we now lynch this woman, as it were, the Romans will come in because we will have created a scene. You will have created a scene, Jesus, and they'll get rid of you. What does Jesus do? We're told he begins writing in the sand. And of course, one of the questions that you want to ask is, what was he writing? What was he writing? But maybe what he was writing was not really the significant thing. What John says, or what the story in John says, Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Now, that last part seems a bit redundant, to be honest. What else would he be writing with? Well, I suppose a stick. But no, he used his finger. Why? Well, there are echoes. And I'm sure that when you've been preaching your way through John or sort of talking about it at house groups or wherever you might talk about it, you will know that John echoes the Old Testament all the time. And it's kind of like for us, we might not know it so well, but for his first readers, it's the only scripture they had. So all the time, John's echoing what's going on. The 10 Commandments were given by the finger of God. The message of judgment on the wall of a foreign king was written with the hand of God. Many, many tekel. You've been found, you've been weighed, and you've found wanting, the message said, written with a finger. And in Luke, Jesus talked about himself. He said, well, he was being accused of being devilish. And he said, but if I'm coming and casting out demons with the finger of God, the power of God, how can I be working on the devil's side? So in other words, this little part in John, it's like this idea of Jesus is there, and John wants to go look at his finger. Look, what's that remind you of? It reminds you of God saying, this is the law. It reminds you of a judgment. It reminds you of power. But maybe what they really noticed, imagine the scene. It's in the middle of a market place. You've got this woman who's kind of like disheveled. She's been dragged into place. She would just be a young woman. She wouldn't be old. She's dragged into place in front of a whole bunch of men. And she's frightened. She's really frightened. And Jesus is just sort of like bending down and writing in the sand. I think you've got a lot of fear going on. If you were the woman, what would you be frightened of? You might be frightened that your family would find out or that your husband would find out. You might be frightened of that first stone being thrown. The first hit, where's it going to come from? And your eyes would be darting round the crowd, looking and flinching just to know who's going to throw first. And can I protect myself? You might be frightened because, is this it? You get a whole bunch of blokes with rock. There's a likelihood either you're not going to come out of here with bones, or it might actually be you won't come out at all. Is this how it ends for you? Shame, dishonor, broken bones. Can you imagine her fear? But I think the men are frightened too. I don't think this is not to condone it at all. But I wonder what they were frightened of. I think it's a scene of fear. I think, what were they frightened of? Why did they choose this to put Jesus to a test? I wonder if they saw their own wife or daughter in this. I wonder if they just despised her. I wonder if the whole sort of scenario is one of, not just here, but in the gospel, it's one of fear. We're losing control. Jesus is coming and he's not doing what we want. And we're frightened. The fear of a loss of boundaries, the fear of shame. The only one that's not fearful is Jesus. And then the woman hears him say, okay, boys, First one, without sin, you throw first. If I'd been that woman, that would not be what I want you to say right then. Go, Jesus says. Off you go. Throw. If you know you're sinless, your turn. John writes and says, they start to melt away. Intriguingly, the oldest leave first. Why did the oldest go first? Do you remember when you were 17? I know some of you perhaps are not much more than 17 now, so it's like yesterday. But for some of us, it's like it's a different century. Do you remember when you were 17 and you knew everything? And you were so sure. Sorry. You were, I'll just talk to you. It's like, you've got it sorted. You know how the world works. You know it's black and white. It's right and wrong. Everything should be sorted. It's about justice. And how can people not do the right thing? When you're 17, if you don't think like that at 17, Lord help you. You should think like that at 17. But maybe when you're 57 or 67, you've lived a little. And it's not that you're compromised, it's just you know what you're like. And you know that every time you throw a stone at someone else, you've been there. You've thought that. You might have done that. No one else might have found out, but you know. And the older you get, hopefully, the more gracious you become, because the more self-aware you become. Yeah, I don't know if you can visualize this, but the oldest guys, just start dropping their rocks. Until only the 17-year-olds left. And then they go too. And Jesus is still bending down. Let me come out of that story into our own story. I wonder if you play that story out where you might see yourself in that story. I wonder whether you see yourself as the woman caught. It was Rowan Williams who at one time was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I remember him saying, he said, if there's 100 people walking down the street and someone came and whispered to each of them, they know about you, 99 would run. If you only knew. If you only knew. And sometimes when we know ourselves and we might fear being caught or people knowing us, when we are caught out, we just feel shamed. What do they think now of us? Or I wonder if you're on the other side and if you're honest enough to go, in a culture of increasing outrage, I'm the one that's ready to throw the rocks at people I think are disturbing our security. I'm the one that's so right. I'm the one that can see 2020. I'm the one that becomes part of this whole outrage. I wonder whether, I suppose, you fear the rock might hit you, or whether you're holding the rock. Jesus knew the brokenness of the image of God in the men. And he knew the brokenness of the image in the woman. We were created for better than this. We were created for better than this. One of the things I think happens to us when we become Christians is we begin a long journey that actually makes us more human. The thing that was damaged by sin, originally, chapters 1 to 11 in Genesis, was the breaking of the image that God has created us in. It's not ruled out, it's not obliterated, but it's fractured. It's why in our world you get people who do the best things possible and the worst things possible, because it's like we're broken. And when you come to Jesus and you surrender to him, he promises to restore all that's broken. He takes our lives and brings us into his image. We who got unveiled faces, we reflect the Spirit who's beginning to recreate something in us. What's he recreating? A brilliant humanity. Not bound by our sort of ethnic divides, not bound by our judgmentalism, not bound by our sin, but actually we're becoming more and more human. Jesus knew the men were broken, and he knew they needed to be restored. And he knew the woman was broken and needing to be restored. So who condemns you? Jesus said. Who condemns you? And she goes, well, they've all gone. And Jesus, in line with what he'd said in chapter 3, God didn't send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. I'm not here to condemn you, Jesus says. I'm here that you might be restored. Go. Leave your life of sin. It's almost like Jesus is saying to the woman, not only have I saved you from the rocks that others were throwing at you, you don't even need to throw rocks at yourself anymore. You don't need to live with the story of, I'm the adulteress. I'm the one that messed up. You don't need that to be written over your life. Now I'm a guest, so I have no idea how many of you committed adultery last night. So we're just going to ask if you'd like to put your... No. I'm guessing none of you. But there'll be some of you who lost your temper this week and said stuff that you regret. And there'll be some of you that lied because if you told the truth, you were frightened what would happen to you next. There'll be some of you who watched stuff that you shouldn't have watched. And you felt really bad about it afterwards, but you carried on watching. There's some of you that just carry that bitter root of unforgiveness in your heart. And every time that person comes into your mind, you just would wish they were not around anymore. Because we're broken, aren't we? And we can easily, we say it about one another, she's so bitter. He's so mean. He's just an angry man. And we write these narratives over our lives. And Jesus rewrote a narrative over an adulteress. You're not the adulteress. Go and sin no more. Begin again. Start again. You don't need to be who you were. You don't need to be the woman they think you are. You don't need to be the woman who's frightened that you might get caught again. You don't need to be that person. Go and sin no more. Start again. I don't condemn you. Never did, Jesus says. Go and start again. So who is this Jesus in the story? Well, he's not afraid, is he? He's not anxious. He's not thrown by events. He's not really willing to get himself into a trap he can't get out of. But he is able to transform a situation. Because he goes to the heart and he tells them what he sees. And the story has been passed down to us in the middle of a conversation about who Jesus was and was believed to be and is and who he is for us. And I think it's well placed because I think I see myself in the men and I think I see myself in the woman. And what I desperately need most days is to hear the word of Jesus. I'm not going to condemn you. Let's just take a minute. There's a lot of words there. What's the word that's worth holding? What do you want to carry? What do you want to hold on to? Where were you? What was going on with your train of thought? Where did you go? What's the word of the Lord for you today? What's the question maybe even, but what's the word of the Lord for you? Just give you a minute or two. And then essentially I'm just asking, what are you thinking? Yeah, we'll have a microphone and then anybody. Okay, so the way this works is I say what you're thinking and then you all raise your hands and I go, we haven't got time for all of those.